Okay, good morning. Thanks so much, Devil, for the kind introduction. So, Leah Goodman. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet today and acknowledge their connection to land, water and community, as well as pay my respect to elders past and present and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders in the room today. Yes, BioIntellect is a life science consultancy. We do work from preclinical all the way through to commercialisation, helping innovation reach patients is particularly our aim. We were very pleased to work with Macquarie University on that white paper that did show the significant economic benefit of R&D to this precinct and to many other parts of the country. We also work very closely with state government, work across the entire ecosystem, but we're working very closely with state government at the moment in the GMP design, build and operationalisation of the viral vector facility out at Westmead, as well as the RNA pilot manufacturing facility here at Macquarie Park. Personally, in my career history as a leader of Merck and Sanofi, I made the decision to relocate our head offices into Macquarie Park one of the reasons was to take advantage of the ecosystem that exists here and really benefit the whole community of those countries, of those companies, from a local perspective and setting the perspective of the benefit the country brings in R&D to our global headquarters. So let me do two things. One, remind you that there is a Slido Q&A, which is why I have my phone here. So please, there's the QR code up the top. If there are any questions, if nothing comes through here, I will just ask people to stand up and introduce themselves and ask questions of this fantastic panel. But firstly, let me introduce them. So Dr. Darren Saunders, in addition to his very large impact in the New South Wales R&D ecosystem as Executive Director and Deputy Chief Scientist and Engineer with the New South Wales Government, Darren displays his expertise as a biomedical scientist, both through his position as Adjunct Associate Professor with the University of Sydney, as well as many of you will know, as a Eureka Prize-winning scientist and communicator, as evidenced by his work with the ABC. Dr. Douglas Campbell, who prefers to be called Doug, is the epitome of our discussion today as Head of R&D for Glytherix, a company developing targeted radiopharmaceuticals for the treatment of cancer, who just 2 weeks ago announced at the European Association of Nuclear Medicine some really groundbreaking research in the field of dosimetry and radiobiology. In addition, Doug is Head of R&D for Menomic International, a biotech company who develops and commercialises blood tests for prostate cancer diagnosis, and has been developing some very cool innovation around risk scores, providing an indication of the likelihood of the presence of clinically significant, that is aggressive, prostate cancer. And finally, but very importantly, as you've heard earlier this morning, Professor Ian Paulsen. Ian holds the title of Distinguished Professor at Macquarie University with an immense contribution over 17 years to the university's success, and is both Director of the ARC Centre of Excellence in Synthetic Biology and Director of the Australian Genome Foundry. He's a world-leading researcher in microbiology and a pioneer in microbial genomics and synthetic biology. Please join me in welcoming our panel. Okay, so I'm going to start with the person closest to me. So you were set up. So look, the New South Wales Government, it's been referred to a couple of times this morning, the New South Wales Government is really investing quite significantly in the RNA facility and the research network as well. Can you give us an overview, Darren, of the project and how it will work, and with particular reference to the model from a enablement of R&D as well as the relationship with a private player like Myeloid?
Yeah, thanks, Leah.
I've
managed to untangle it and get it working. I'll just acknowledge my colleague Scott here as well from Health Infrastructure, who's sort of co-leading this project from the construction side. So, yeah, look, it is an interesting project, and it is a really unique model. You know, so the government has put a lot of money into capital to build a facility just up the hill here near the old observatory. There's a bit of concrete going in the ground up there at the moment, actually, and that's one part of the project where the government has, recognised a need for bridging the gap between what's going on in university, academic and startup commercial labs and bringing the technology into clinical trials. So there's a need to move this technology. We hear the word translation. I don't always like using that word, but it's basically moving the technology into the clinic, right? And So there's a huge capital investment going on there. I think at the same time, government almost always also recognise that it's probably not their job to run a biotech company. And I think that's a really sensible insight. And so the decision was made to bring in a commercial operator. It's an American biotech company called Myeloid, who are in the field of making immunotherapies for cancer. And they've set up a new entity called Aurora Biosciences, who will run that facility up at Macquarie University on behalf of the government. And then we reserve capacity in that facility for researchers locally to come and access the facility to make products under GMP grade to go into clinical trials. So it's really about enabling clinical trials. And the flip side of that is we've also set up a separate company which will sort of oversee that operation and oversee that relationship with Myeloid. And Petra, one of our board members, is here. That company was recently launched called RNA Australia. So it is a different model. It's about sort of recognising that the government has a role to play in investment, but the government doesn't necessarily want to be operating down in the weeds of how that works.
It's really interesting. It's really living what was said earlier in that gap Australia has on enabling commercialisation, actually getting to patients. So it's the investment at the R&D space as well as the enablement through clinical trial via manufacturing.
Yeah, and we've looked very carefully. There are a lot of different facilities being brought online around Australia, not just in New South Wales. And we looked very carefully at where the gaps were, where the critical needs were. And so that preclinical to clinical jump is one of the most important ones. So we've got the Moderna facility coming online in Melbourne. That's population scale manufacturing. That will make tens of millions of doses of things. This is at a smaller scale and is really designed to get those products first into the clinic. And I will point out that it's not just human products. We're also looking at agricultural and veterinary products, which is a really important aspect of that sort of biosecurity and sovereign capacity that the Minister mentioned earlier.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I'm going to keep on the theme of Macquarie Park innovation, Ian, and with that in mind, would you mind explaining to us the capabilities of the Centre of Excellence in the Foundry and maybe give some insights into what sort of industries they support? And I think you can't get away from referring to the synthetic biology innovation, seeing it's been referred to so many times this morning already.
Thanks. So synthetic biology is a relatively new science where we try and engineer living organisms to do things that they don't naturally do. So in our case, we're trying to engineer microbes to produce a wide range of things that we currently get from fossil fuels. So can we get engineered microbes to turn waste or agricultural biomass into fuels, into plastics, into platform and specialty chemicals? And in the process of that, help decarbonise, help develop a circular economy. So the two entities that I lead, one is the ARC Centre of Excellence in Synthetic Biology. It's headquartered here at Macquarie. It's a 7-year, $50 million research centre supported by the Australian Research Council, and it's sort of got tentacles all over the country. It covers 9 universities, 19 research groups. We have 30 industry partners. And what I'm most proud of is that we've been running for 4 years now, but we've spun out 9 startup companies in those 4 years. We've now raised $190 million in venture capital. And they're starting to build both pilot and full-scale manufacturing plants in one or two cases. So we're seeing that journey from exciting ideas in the lab turning into actual real products and jobs and export income in the real world. The second entity that I'm director of is the Australian Genome Foundry. That's a younger thing, and that's a national facility. So it's supported by NCRIS, I never get this acronym right, the National Cooperative Research Infrastructure Strategy. I might got it right. And via Bioplatforms Australia. So this is a facility meant to accelerate synthetic biology research and support the research needs of both industry and academics across Australia. And so it provides services we can build synthetic microbes, we can test synthetic microbes, we can do high throughput fermentations there for synthetic microbes and perform it under industrial conditions. And what that's really trying to do is to accelerate the research and get proof of principle at a laboratory scale that then companies and startups can then go elsewhere and do large scale fermentations, which is things I don't understand. So the Foundry tries to be, so universities are not generally associated with words nimble and flexible. The Foundry has worked with Macquarie University to streamline as many of the university systems as they can so that it can be nimble and flexible and help startups on timelines that work for startups, which is different timelines from which universities usually operate on. And so we can provide, we provide fee-for-service work. We also have incubation spaces for companies. So we have 4 companies currently incubating in the Foundry, and we also work closely with the Macquarie Incubator. And we can also do more collaborative projects. I've probably waffled on enough.
No, thank you. It's really interesting. I imagine there'd be questions on what would you say are some of the best practices that you've learned that you could share with other precincts and innovators? And that those words nimble and agility and those sorts of things are probably part of it, yeah? Okay, thank you. Interesting. I spent yesterday at Oz Biotech Invest in Melbourne with a whole lot of innovators from across the country sort of pitching their innovation, I guess, to a room full of investors. It's really amazing to see the sort of innovation we have so close to home, that and in the country overall, but nice to see that we're really well set up in Macquarie Park to enable that real commercialisation from innovation. So, of course, that naturally leads me to you, Doug. Doug, can you tell us about Mnemonic and Glytherix and how these 2 startups within this precinct have really grown through support and the collaboration as part of the park? And really interested in your thoughts on co-location as well as part of that.
Sure. It
is.
Before I get into that, I think I'd like to say that the Minister's speech was the best speech I've ever heard. It's great to have someone who really gets what we're trying to do and sees the long-term future, where the stock market isn't dominated by banks and money funds, but rather, sees in our own areas, we look at
sorry, but we can't hear you up the back. We'd love to hear you.
How's that? Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I won't repeat it all other than to say the Minister has done a great job. It's very inspiring. We look at companies like Telix locally and Clarity in the radiopharmaceuticals business, which have made significant returns on investment for the shareholders in a relatively short period of time. In terms of what both Mnemonic and Glytherix look at, relatively young companies without large cash resources. So we need to balance our budget very carefully, but we do need access to things like labs and expertise. And a huge shout out to Macquarie. We've found them to be incredibly cooperative. The incubator, the hospital, the ethics committee, the general ability to get things done quickly is far superior to any of the other universities that we've been associated with. And that makes all the difference when you're small. You're often running on a year's burn, and you can't afford to have 6 months go past while you're negotiating a contract to access key equipment. From Mnemonics perspective, developing the MyCheck prostate cancer test, we needed to access patient samples, and having the hospital here and working with Professor David Gillett and Manish Patel and the other clinicians meant that we could rapidly accrue the hundreds of samples that we needed. The ethics committee was very helpful there. Other institutions, we'd probably still be waiting for the approval a year down the track. And that's just not feasible for a company. So that's been very helpful. From a Glytherix hat, we did our first in-human clinical trial here. The first time our drug had ever been administered to any patient. It was a radiopharmaceutical, so again, added complexity. But with the hospital and with Macquarie Medical Imaging on site, we had everything we needed from a safety and an efficacy perspective. Again, the ethics was incredibly quick on that compared to many others. So that makes all the difference when you come in, you have the clinicians engaged, you have the ability to rapidly do something without chewing up your budget on paying rent for the labs. You need access to expensive equipment, and the ability to leverage that through the university is great. You know, we've also had the opportunity to host some PhD students, and we've really benefited from that. We've had 2 clinicians who did PhDs. They were outstanding in terms of getting stuff done. So the ability to be able to just walk, 100 yards down the corridor, say, professor, or bump into them in the corridor, that proximity is fantastic. From the Dynamic point of view, we're commercialising our test with Douglas Campbell and Sonic just down the road. So again, the ability to just pop in the car, it's 5 minutes round. But also if we have overseas investors who want to come, they've been incredibly helpful as well in terms of showing the facility. So having everything you need in one spot is fantastic. The only thing we don't yet have is the manufacturing for our radiopharmaceuticals, but hopefully that will come online soon.
Yeah, build the cyclotron, hey? I don't have any questions coming through the Slido. Does anyone in the room have any questions? This is not a room of shy people, I'm sure. Okay, well, I'm going to pick up on the theme. If not, I'm going to pick up on the theme of that collaboration and partnership. Thanks. I can go back to Ian and ask you, Ian, what are some of the types of collaborations between academia, industry and government that you'd like to see grow in Macquarie Park?
Okay, as many as we can. So I'm going to talk about my philosophy of working with industry partners, I guess. So from my perspective, it's all about building relationships. And so I like to pride ourselves that we under-promise and over-deliver, because I've seen too many other organisations that do the opposite. So I don't ever want to be letting an industry partner who needs something down. And I return to what I said earlier, we're flexible. So for instance, Microbiogen is a local microbiology startup company. They make yeast strains. Currently, something like a third of the ethanol that's made to put in petrol around in the US is made from their strains. We started a conversation with them, and after exploring possibilities, the interesting model that came up with them is they had a staff member who never got a higher degree but wanted to get a piece of paper to further their career. So she's come back and has done a master's and is now just starting a PhD on a joint project between Macquarie and Microbiogen, and spends roughly half a time in both locations. So it depends on the particular project and whatever. We work very closely with our startups. So we've got some very exciting startups that have spun out of Macquarie. One out of my group is Number 8 Bio. They're a company that also engineer yeast strains, so they're interested in reducing methane emissions from cattle. So they've engineered a product that's gone through several rounds of cattle trials now and shown 95% methane mitigation, and also now productivity gains in the cattle. They gain more weight in the same amount of feed. And so they're literally housed in the same building as us, and there's a daily interconnectivity between our young researchers and their team. And so there's this synergy between. I don't know if they've answered any of your questions. But
No, it's fascinating.
Future of a politician.
Okay, we do have a question. Love that.
Yeah, so my name's Darren Saunders, and I'm in the next session, so it's a bit of a lead into that. So the sort of thing you're talking about has exactly been my experience, that you start out small and PhD candidates, you get interesting people in the company won't understand, but still their company backs them to do research and get a degree on. And there's a lot of that type of interaction that I see happening across a lot of Australian universities. You don't often see that it gets taken up by companies in a way that then leads to them being very competitive. And so I would like to ask Doug to tell me a bit more about, and just the way ignorance in this area, I mean, what is genomic and ignorance? How big are you? How internationally are you going? What's your global outlook? And how are we going to scale what we've got that's taken out of the lab and taken to the world and produce, variegatable people and how about valuable exports that our country can help?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So I'll start with the easy one with Monomic. So we essentially have a test that will give you a risk of clinically significant prostate cancer. And that's on the market here in Australia with Sonic, and in the US running our own lab and distributing that. There's certain regulations in the US that mean that you can get that on the market quicker than, say, in Europe. So it uses existing markers that you can run on a sort of standard clinical chemistry analyzer and combines the results using an algorithm. So essentially the lab will measure those results, they'll send it up to the cloud, our algorithm sits in the cloud, reports back, and then the report then goes to the clinician. Clinician will look at that risk, they'll determine the next step, whether that's a biopsy or whether they can afford to wait or maybe proceed to another imaging step. In the US, there's reimbursement codes that already exist for this, and that's critical because it's sort of a 2-year process to get a CPT code otherwise. And so we can leverage that to get payment from Medicare initially, and then there's a number of other payers. So the margins on that are really very high in the US. In Australia, it's out of pocket at the moment, and what we'll need to do there is a health economic study, which is potentially something we can do with New South Wales Health to look at the benefits versus the costs there. So we can run that essentially with the 4 or 5 people here plus the US sales team. So with the partnership with Sonic, we'll need a couple of people, but they already have obviously a large presence in the US. They have a slightly different structure with its large urology group practices, which aggregate up to 120 urologists in one centre. And so you can sort of sell to them and hit 40-50% of the market with a relatively small sales team. And then the idea is just to build revenues in the US, and then as the rest of the world comes online, it's again more challenging because there's a lot of health economic studies in each jurisdiction. So you've got to work out whether it's worth going into a particular market, some of the smaller markets. For Glytherics, it's a little bit more challenging because the radiopharmaceutical product has a very short half-life. So normally with drugs, you make them, they sit on the shelf 2 or 3 years, they can be used. The radiopharmaceuticals that we're using have half-life of between 3 days and 7 days. And so you've got to not only manufacture it, but get it to the patient. And so 5 years ago, those supply chains didn't really exist to anywhere near the degree that they have today. There's recent approval of a product called Pluvicto for prostate cancer, which a lot of the early work was done in Australia, but it's been approved in the US as well as here. And it's essentially an injectable for patients who have failed most available therapies. It uses a radioisotope lutetium that's produced in reactors typically. And we have the benefit of having the reactor down in leukocytes that can produce lutetium. So from the early stages that we're at in sort of phase 1 clinical trials, we're working with various Australian suppliers and manufacturers. Currently, we're working with South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute to manufacture the zirconium and also to perform the radio labelling on our antibody. That then can get shipped around Australia overnight. So from that point of view, we've got the supply chain here. In the US, there are now many suppliers and manufacturers and contract manufacturers, and we've talked to most of those. And so we'd then most likely set up 1 or 2 sites in the US that you would then manufacture and then distribute. So that'd be contract manufacturing. And again, we wouldn't be setting those up. We'd probably use those existing manufacturers. We looked at potentially what it would cost to buy or to make one of those sites from scratch, and you're talking $50 million probably. The challenge is also getting the expertise. There's not that many people who are trained properly in the area, but it is an emerging area. So more and more people will go into that. So from our perspective, there's a couple of models. One is the kind of acquisition model. You prove clinical proof of concept. Someone likes it. Novartis has been acquiring a lot, although BMS and other big pharmas are now looking at this as a very attractive treatment methodology. Or you can take an approach like, say, Telix has, where they're really a global pharmaceutical company based in Australia, but they've got products on the market and selling in the US. Now, they've got a much larger sales force, and so you need the capital support for that. We've generally found in the US, you talk to investors, they have an extra zero on the end. And, I think the comments around the $4 trillion sitting in super, 1% of that going into high innovation, technologies would transform the sector. And I think it should be closer to 10, personally.
Do you see the universities sector and research institutes as being the source of innovation?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, absolutely. So the antibody that got there was originally generated by Town Muscle back in 1988. And so a lot of the work was done through grant funding to get early proof of concept. But these things take a long time to develop. But we're constantly looking at, through the BD departments of the universities for similar products. And then, the question is what sort of model do you use and how far can you get it? One of the good things about some of the grants are that they're actually providing funding for early stage clinical trial, phase 1 clinical trials, so that when you go out to raise money, you're already dealing with clinical proof of concept, or at least phase 1 safety data, and you get a much better valuation. You've reduced the risk significantly for the investors. So I think things like the MMR funds, the more the better, and the longer that the unis can be supported to reduce the risk for investors, the better.
Thanks for the question. Great. Thank you, Doug. It's interesting, as new technology, and I think radiopharmaceuticals are a classic example of real innovative technology. It's a place that an innovation district can play such a big role, not just from a funding or from an R&D, but a country enablement. No, the TGA don't know how to deal with radiopharmaceutical approvals at the moment. There's a whole lot of problem happening at patents. Where does your patent sit, on your antibody, on your linker, or on the payload? There's a whole lot of questions as innovation from districts like this grows, that the government, that the support that the district can provide in that other enablement piece can really give. Have I got one more minute to ask a question? Any more questions? Thanks, Scott. You always ask a good question.
I'll start there. I'm totally biased. Because I'm working in the RNA facility, I'm interested to think how this innovation district might make use of that facility, or how it is exciting players and looking forward to engaging with it.
I can't answer on behalf of the community, obviously. I'd like to think that's the case. I mean, that's partly the reasoning for citing it here, obviously. And I think, we've heard from both Ian and Doug that there is something about having a sort of critical mass of people and organisations, institutions and companies in one place where you get those, it enables those organic interactions. I mean, there's a great example here a few weeks ago. I think you were there, David, where we got a whole bunch of engineers and mathematicians and biologists and all sorts of people together in a room and just sort of talked about, well, how do we bring these two worlds together to bring entirely new products into being, right? And I think this is an example of what could happen around here. Plus having access to the university, to the clinical side of things at the hospital. And one thing, I just want to touch on what Doug said, that time of being able to do things quickly in a startup space is everything. I've worked in biotech startups, it's everything. It can kill an entire company, not just a project. But it's not just important from a business perspective. If you're a patient, time is everything, especially in a cancer context. So having those things all together in one place is absolutely critical, right? It really does shorten that timeline, and it is a long timeline in a lot of cases. You know, things that I worked on 20 years ago are only now just moving towards clinic because it just takes a long time, and it's to get things into clinical trial is a big complex space. You know, you've got the regulatory stuff. TJ don't know how to deal with lots of regulatory things. It's part of the challenge, right? Things, it's new technology. Yeah. So all of that, having that mass of people, and not just scientists and engineers, but social scientists and lawyers and people who know how to deal with social license and the regulatory and legal space, having all of those people together in one place is really important.
I think if I could just add maybe as a challenge to New South Wales government.
We've got a few on our plate, Doug.
This one should be relatively simple stuff. Now, the question is often, you know, you might be walking next door to someone and not know what capabilities they have. And so some kind of interrogatable database, AI, however, you know, ChatGPT for something, you know, who's doing this? I need a bunch of prostate cancer specimens. Who's got them, right? And you'll find someone out of Liverpool that you've never heard of has got them, and you can establish that collaboration. I don't know exactly how you do it, but I think it would save a hell of a lot of time if we could have something like a register that was easily searchable.
Okay, so we've gone 3 minutes over our extended time. Does anyone have any final questions before I ask you to join with me in thanking Darren, Ian and Doug?